interesting before listening to one of the core values about lifelong learning. That's one of the key things that we need to embrace as speakers, because if we're not growing, we're actually stagnating. I remember the story of a young man who goes into a certain town and he meets an elderly gentleman at the gate and he says, "Can you tell me," he says, "were there any great men and women born in this town?" You know, we live in a culture that almost looks for instant greatness, instant gratification. Doesn't always appreciate that to get to where we are, to be excellent at what we do, doesn't happen like that. It doesn't happen at a one-day seminar. But it takes time, it's a process. It was mentioned before about what you sow, you reap. To sow and to reap is a process. And as the young man said to the elderly gentleman, he said, "Can you tell me, were there any great men and women born in this town?" And the elderly gentleman replied and said, "No, only babies." And that's the foundation of it, that we make a choice, as was said before, to grow and to develop and to get that cutting edge in our speaking. And one of the things for me that's always differentiates speakers that you want to listen to is a combination of two things. This is really the bread and butter, it's the fire and it's the wood, is that they have a passion for what they're talking about that comes from the gut. It's not just, you know, ostentatious, superficial passion. There's that authenticity. You can really see and feel that they actually believe what they're speaking about. And secondly, the content is good. It's not just passion for the sake of passion. You know, we want fire but not fireworks. Does that make sense? There is something about it that actually resonates with people. There's a presence about what they're saying, and there is a substance to the communication. So I want to lay a foundation by just talking a little bit about inspiration in our speaking, inspiration in communication. The very word inspire or inspiration comes from the Latin inspirare, which means to breathe life into someone else. Now, we were mentioning before that many of us are involved in different aspects of communication, in coaching on the one-on-one level or a team level, in training and so forth. But my particular objective tonight is to really cover this aspect of inspirational speaking or motivational speaking. Communication that seeks to energize people, that's not going to send people to sleep, but it's actually going to set people on fire. I mean, we've all faced the audience. I don't know if you've ever faced an audience, you look at them and they look like bulldogs chewing a wasp. You ever seen that one? Look like they've just been baptised in vinegar. And I won't go into all the details of all the places I've spoken, but if there's a place out there, I've been there, whether it's Brixton Prison or churches or universities, I've been there, and sometimes the people aren't that glad to see you, especially some of the engagements I've been asked to fulfill. And I think part of our role as speakers is that our words carry life, they carry energy, they carry power. There's a sense in which you can see people being changed before your eyes. That's an exciting thing. And one of the things I first noticed as I began to develop and to get experience in my speaking career was that when you're speaking, there's an unconscious, or should I say, invisible dialogue that's going on. How many of you here have had quite a bit of experience in speaking, have turned up before an audience and just felt a brick wall? Anyone ever felt that? And yet you go somewhere else and you're as free as a bird. Now, when I first began to speak, it was like I would just allow that environment to overwhelm me. But now it makes me more determined to break through. And I think speaking's like that. It's like a hammer, it's like a fire that can break rocks in pieces, that can penetrate into the hearts of people and make a difference in their life. And so one of the first things I think that's foundational that we have to appreciate as speakers, if we're going to understand the value and the power of releasing life into people when they hear us, is that we're there to breathe life into them. You know, we're thinking about the current recession and all the things that people are feeling discouraged about. Well, what an opportunity for the speakers to stand up and to bring a message of hope, to bring a message of revitalization, and to bring a message of life, to touch people right where they are. I remember listening to a guy once. He was an ex-IRA terrorist. And you know, when we talk about professional speaking, you think of organisations like Toastmasters. Sometimes we spend so much time on the intricacies and the eloquence of speaking and all the fine arts that go with it. Well, I listened to this guy, and I'll be honest, he was barely able to string two sentences together. He obviously hadn't been to school beyond the age of 7. But I never forgot his message, because it was just absolutely full of passion and fire. I say he was an IRA terrorist. He was, when he spoke, he was no longer. He'd had a massive value transformation. His life had been totally transformed, and he was talking about what he was compared to what he was now. And I just remember never forgetting that, and I thought to myself, but you know, the guy was, he dropped his H's, he couldn't finish his sentences. Now, I'm not saying there isn't a place for good speaking and we have to focus on our presentation, but you know, at the end of the day, if I had to choose between the two, I know what I'd choose. I'd choose passion and fire, because you can have people stand up and they say all the right things. Everything is right, every I is dotted, every T is crossed. I mean, the content is amazing, the posture, the body language, the prosody, the voice projection, it's all there, but something's missing. Do you follow me? Something's missing. And this is something, unfortunately, we see in many people who have become, and I know we're called the Professional Speakers Association, and it's a good title, but don't become professional. Always remain a learner. The day you think you've arrived, that's the day you stop growing. That's the day you lose your cutting edge. The day you think, I've got it all together. Now I'm thinking now, probably every year I speak to about 20,000 people, anything from audiences of 12 to well over 1,000. But every time I get up to speak, whether it's 10 or it's 1,000 people, there's always that sense of, how would I put it? There's always that sense of anticipation. I believe a bit of nervousness is actually good. I think if you're kind of just able to get up and say, I can just do this, I've done it so many times before, I think that can be a sign that the edge can be lost. And when it comes to inspiring people, to breathing life into others as we speak, it's interesting, isn't it, that every time we speak, you can't speak a word without breath coming out at the same time. And I think there's almost an analogy there, that the words we speak are breath and life, they are spirit and they are life. I want to tell you about two of my role models, two of my heroes. I have a number of heroes, but I want to tell you about two that you may have heard of. Both from Britain, both lived in the 18th century. One was called George Whitefield, a man called George Whitefield. Some of you may have heard of him. The other man was John Wesley. John Wesley was the founder of the Methodist Church. And these guys were such awesome communicators and so radical in their generation that they actually got chucked out of churches. The Anglican church of which they were a part, they were Oxbridge men. John Wesley was a tutor at Oxford, and when I went to Oxford University, I didn't study at Oxford University, but when I went to visit it a while ago, I went to the, how many seen the Harry Potter film? The big banqueting table. Well, I went into that room there and they had a portrait up there of John Wesley. I went to the halls where he was a tutor. And these guys were so radical and their communication was so powerful that the established church of that time found them to be just too outside of the box. So what did they decide to do? They took their communication to the open air. And I was reading of George Whitefield that in the year 1741, he spoke in Cambuslang, I don't know if I've said the town right there, Ailey, but just 4 miles outside of Glasgow, to 50,000 people without a PA system. I don't know about it, that's awesome. And wherever he went, wherever George Whitefield went, he was probably one of the best communicators that this nation has ever produced. People would actually run to hear him. Wesley was quite similar. He'd done about 250,000 miles on horseback and spoke 50,000 times. And again, thousands would gather without PA. And these two guys had such an impact on the moral fabric of Britain that even secular historians said that they saved Britain from going into a revolution like France. They changed, through their communication, the face of the country. Not just in Britain, but also in the States as well. And it was said of George Whitefield that when he spoke, that his words were as fire and the people's hearts were as grass. What a metaphor for inspiration. Because many times people have come to me and said, well, you know, inspirational speaking, it's just bubble and froth, you can't change anything, you can't transform anything. People get excited and then they wake up the next day, they can't remember what they got excited about. But there was actual transformation of the moral fabric of the nation. Whether you share their value system or not, the principle I'm holding up is that powerful communicators change things. Powerful communicators move people. And that's why I mentioned John Wesley and Whitefield as two of my communication heroes. Not just because of their ability to speak, but the impact that they had. They asked John Wesley, they said, why is it so many people come to hear you speak? And he said, God set me on fire and the people came to watch me burn. I thought, fantastic. set on fire, and the people came to watch him burn. Now, that's what we need to be is in an inspirational context. If you're not excited about what you're talking about, how on earth do you expect anyone else to get excited about it? If you are not passionate deeply from your gut about what you're saying, why are you standing up and saying anything at all? Because people resonate with your communication. People will either resonate, or the opposite of resonance is dissonance. If they see that you're saying one thing but your body language is saying another, they will even subconsciously register that you don't believe what you're saying. Again, I come back to George Whitfield. One guy one day went to see him speak, and his friend said to him, "You're not going to go and hear what he says. You don't believe what he says, do you?" He says, "No, I don't, but he does." So let's be convinced about the fact that even if others may not agree with our value system or the message we've got to bring, let us at least be sure about the fact that we can never be accused of not believing what we're speaking about, of not having a true, heartfelt passion to communicate with life and with fire. We said of George Whitfield speaking that it wasn't like the cannon at Portsmouth that would go off in the morning and evening like a gentle discharge. Everything, his words proceeded like life and like fire. And I just use that as a model of how I think when we speak, people should have a resonance with what we're saying. There should be an affinity as we touch people's emotions, as we move people's wills, and as we educate people's minds. Now, training can be somewhat different, although I'm not saying inspiration can't come into that, because I think we have to move from inspiration to application, but it's a good start, because people need that sense of momentum to get going, to get flowing, shall we say. And I've found that in order to put passion and presence and energy into our presentations, we need to be conscious of a number of things. I mentioned resonance before. I believe that there's something beyond the words that we could call presence or resonance. It's interesting that I've spent quite a lot of time in our coaching and training work looking at emotional intelligence. And we work with a number of leaders in that area in a coaching and a training capacity. And one of the things they found that has been proved both in psychology and in neuroscience is that emotions are contagious. Emotions are contagious. And whereas our circulatory system is a closed loop system, in other words, if I've got something wrong in my blood, I can't pass it to you directly just by talking to you, our actual emotional system isn't. You ever been with someone, spoke for 5 minutes and then feel drained and wondered why? You ever wondered why some people that you're with energise you and some people you're with just drain the life out of you? See, as speakers, we carry emotional vitality. We're influencers. And we have the ability to change an environment. And what I believe is that the best speakers actually pull people, metaphorically speaking, into their gravity. It's like gravity. People are attracted into their zone. There's an invisible connection that takes place, mind to mind, heart to heart, will to will. And when you've got people there, it's just like you've caught a fish and you can reel them in for the decision. And the best speakers have that attractive or magnetic element to them, beyond mere inspiration, but where people's hearts feel arrested by what is spoken. And I think when it comes to our inspirational presentations, that is what we should aim for. That's more important than all the niceties of eloquent speech. Because we've all seen people who get up and regurgitate something that they've spoken about 1,000 times, and it's all great, but something's missing. I'll tell you what's missing, in a nutshell. It's the difference between what is missing in a corpse and a living person. What's the difference between a living person and a corpse? Spirit. There's no spirit in the message. They're just going through the motions. It's an empty box. Spirit, fire, energy, passion, whatever you want to call it, earnestness, authenticity. It's missing. And alas, I fear sometimes, that in our profession, some speakers have lost their cutting edge, haven't they? Because they've done it for so long that they've never actually asked themselves, am I still passionate about this? Or they've become so familiar with what they do that they've lost the excitement of it. And it's become just a job, not a calling, not a vocation. And so my encouragement to all of us who are speakers or who aspire to speak is make sure that that fire level, Clive was mentioning before the different stoves, don't be lukewarm, don't be cold, don't be bubbling, be red hot. And people will catch your flame, people will catch your spirit, and they'll go away impacted by what you've said. So inspiration in communication, breathing life. I want to mention 3 things that I believe practically we can apply to our speaking to ensure that our energy levels and our passion is strong. And remember, I'm looking at the combination, because passion alone isn't enough. Remember I said we want fire, but we don't want fireworks. To use an analogy, we want the wood, the substance, but we also want the fire. We don't want fire without wood, we don't want wood without fire. We want the two together. We want content on fire. We want passion in the substance of what it is we have to communicate. And I found that there's 3 key things that if we do as speakers, we can ensure that our messages carry vitality, relevance, and that combination. The first practical thing I think is the greatest challenge, and this is my personal greatest challenge every time I come to speak, is the balance between structure and spontaneity. Structure and spontaneity. That, I believe, for any seasoned speaker is the continual greatest challenge. See, to have bones without flesh, what does that give you? A skeleton. And to have flesh without bones, you've got a jellyfish. Yeah? So we need the flesh and the bones, but we don't want the bones to protrude out so obviously that they actually diminish from the message. And I think as speakers, the danger can be sometimes that we can move to the extreme of being so structured and enslaved to a script that we lose the spontaneity and the passion of our script. It just becomes a recital. And we've all seen speakers who do that. I never forget seeing a guy who was talking about being on fire and he was as cold as a wet blanket. You know, there was no fire there, he was just reading the script. The other side is that people can aim to be spontaneous or extemporary. They speak extemporaneously in a spontaneous way, but there's no substance. And this is especially dangerous for those of us who have the gift of speech and fluency. Depends on our talent levels. Now, I can get up at any time and just speak. I can do that. And it's a great gift to have, and many of us can do that. But it's not enough. Ultimately, we will run out of steam. We need to make sure that the substance of what we're bringing together is quality. And on that foundation, the spontaneity will flow. Now, how you bring that balance in your own speaking career, I think is a matter of judgment. I don't believe there's absolute rules about this. It depends on your temperament, on your talent, on your ability. Every one of us has to find our own style. But let us not be guilty of just being a firecracker, a firework, with no substance to follow through. The balance of structure and spontaneity. To be too structured can make us ultimately boring, basically. And to be too spontaneous can leave out the precision and the sense of sharpness that we need in our communication. The second area I think is absolutely key, and I've mentioned it already. And don't just hear it as a cliche, but really hear this. You have to be passionate about your subject. So I've been really impressed tonight by hearing about this whole area of values, that we are not going to accommodate our message to what the external environment demands, but rather we are going to live with integrity to our message. And people who've lost passion for their subject will be anyone's slave. I mean, it's basically speakers, forgive me to be so candid and blunt here, prostituting themselves, not sticking to what they've been given to do, to what they're unique. You know, we're talking about the aha moment, the goosebumps, the sense of destiny, the sense of this is it. If you move away from that, you may get all the external trimmings that come with it, but something will be empty inside. So to have a passion for your subject that goes beyond the mind, beyond the conscious, deep down into the subconscious, where you're burning with it so brightly that others will just be touched by it. That inner drive, that inner enthusiasm. You know, and as I listen to speakers like Elaine see how her message has been brought out of the background, you can see how that passion begins to emerge. And with Ailey in education and others, it's not just I decided to speak on whatever. It's formed out of life, out of experience, and so it means something beyond just making money. It's about the mission. It's about the purpose, and the money follows. Thank God for that, especially in these times. People say no margin, no mission. But I'd rather have mission over margin. I think if you take care of the mission, the margin takes care of itself. Let me encourage you to read a book which I found absolutely brilliant. Many of you will know Jim Collins' book, Good to Great. Make sure you read Built to Last. Because Built to Last talks about how the most successful organisations put their mission before the money and ended up making money, much more money, than organisations who put the money before the mission. Having a clear sense of purpose. Structure and spontaneity. Being passionate and heartfelt about your subject. And thirdly, and again, forgive me if I'm teaching you to suck eggs because this is almost obvious to speakers, we have to captivate people's hearts, minds, and emotions. And I think many times the reasons our messages may not penetrate, or the reason why a message may not penetrate, is because we've only addressed one aspect of the person. This is why technically lectures have got the reputation for being boring. Why? Because they've filled the mind with knowledge. And I know about boring lectures. I did 2 degrees in theology. And I'm a lecturer myself at the university part-time, but I hope my lectures aren't boring. Because we put some fire into them. Because people should be excited about subjects that matter. And many times you get the common story of the professor who will sit there, doesn't even look up at the class, and just reads from the notes. The content's brilliant, but it's presented in such a boring way that people don't connect with it. Again, I remember hearing the story of an actor and a preacher who were both working in the same town. And the actor used to draw massive crowds, and the preacher drew no one, just like many of the preachers in England today. And the preacher went to the actor and said, "Why is it that you attract all these crowds and no one comes to hear me?" He says, "Because I present my fiction as though it is fact, and you express your fact as though it's fiction." What an indictment, and how true it is. Some of the messages going out, it's like we were talking about hot water bottle, rather than things that can actually transform people's lives. Many of you will know, in addition to the business that I lead, Dunamis, I also have a charity organisation called Parakletos. Won't go into all the dynamics of what that does. But I get so fired up about my life and the things I do. Someone says success in life is to be able to get up in the morning and do what you want to do until you go to bed at night, and then wake up and do the same thing the next day. And I've got that pleasure. It doesn't mean there isn't challenges, but ultimately you're able to craft the mission around your life. See, the other things follow. And many times we are guilty of educating people's minds, but what we haven't done is capture their emotions, move their emotions, and capture their imagination. Hence the power of narrative and the power of story, the power of analogy or parables, so that people can see, so that their ears can be turned into eyes, and they can begin to see with their ears what you're saying to them. People talk about the word illustrate. To illustrate comes from the word illuminate, to shed light. And the greatest teachers have always been great illustrators, and sometimes taken the simple things, the simplest metaphors, parables and analogies to drive home truth into people. What are we doing in our communication beyond the intellectual side of the mind to really capture people's emotions? What's the application of this? Get your message by heart. Of course we have a role to teach the mind. That's a necessity. But also we have to paint those pictures. And that's why the greatest leaders are visionaries. The greatest inspirers are visionaries. Because they know how to paint a picture of where people are going, and people can relate to that. They know how to put that where people are and relate it to them and not speak above their heads. 3 things then that we can apply. Structure and spontaneity. Capturing people's emotions, capturing not just people's minds but their hearts. Capturing the inner core of the person and being passionate about the subject. Final thing I want to say about putting passion and energy into our performances, and it's already been reiterated, mentioned already tonight, but it's this, is integrity in communication. In other words, we have to live true to our values. We have to live true to those absolutes in our lives that make sense. You know, I was talking with someone recently, not too long ago, and we were talking about absolutes, having the way that we live by our convictions and our values. And we're living in a society today that is embracing a philosophy called relativism. It says there are no absolutes, everything's relative. You think it's all right to kill? I don't think it's all right to kill. We're both right. We can both be right. There are no absolutes. And I said to the gentleman, I said, so you're telling me there isn't such a thing as an absolute truth? He said, no. I said, you really sure about that? He says, yeah, absolutely. Stand by your convictions. Live true to your values. Do not sacrifice your values for anything else. They are your anchor. They are the core of your being. And the gift you've been given, the gift I've been given to speak and to communicate with life means that we actually believe there's something worth hearing. We're not driven by external forces. Oh, they want to hear about this, they want to hear about that. I'll just change like a chameleon to make the money. No. The money follows, that's integrity. But we live by what we feel is our main mission. We live by what we feel is our main priority. And if we do that, in conclusion, we will have achieved 4 things with our audience. Number 1, we will have revived them. The fire will have touched their lives. We will have educated their mind. To teach is a necessity. We would have stirred their emotions. To please is sweetness. And we would have moved their will. To move the will is a victory. Because that's when you get to the place of choice. To educate the mind, to stir the emotions, and to move the will. To teach is a necessity. To please and stir the emotion is a sweetness. To move the will, to persuade, is a victory. That's our goal as speakers, is to take the message that's in our head and our heart and put it into the heads and hearts of other people. If we just transform it from there to there, it will be as forgotten as quickly as the thought entered. But if you get people in their gut, they've still got the hook in them as they leave. And I believe that's the power of true inspirational speaking. And what a privileged vocation we have in order to do that. Be passionate about your message, don't compromise, and go for it. Make a difference, because there's people that need to hear you. Thank you.